On September 22, 2025, the world was stunned. President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso, a landlocked West African nation with more than 20 million people, announced a bold decision: a direct investment into the work of Maxwell Chikumbutso, a controversial inventor from Zimbabwe. Chikumbutso claimed that he could turn invisible radio waves into a limitless source of energy. To some, this was a breakthrough capable of freeing hundreds of millions of Africans from darkness. To others, it was a reckless gamble that could plunge an already struggling nation into chaos. Burkina Faso is a country defined by resilience, but also by scarcity. More than 60% of its electricity is imported, mostly from neighboring Côte d'Ivoire. Within its borders, most power generation still depends on costly diesel. In rural areas, the reality is even harsher. While nearly 70% of city dwellers have access to electricity, only about 5% of rural citizens live with the flicker of light at night. In villages across the Sahel, children still study by the dim smoke of kerosene lamps. Hospitals rely on fragile diesel generators, and families wait for convoys of fuel trucks that may or may not arrive at the border. Every delay means silence in classrooms, darkness in operating theaters, and paralysis in military outposts. For decades, this vulnerability has been a chain on the nation's sovereignty. President Traoré's words that day carried the force of defiance. Our hospitals cannot beg for diesel. Our children cannot study by candlelight. Our soldiers cannot defend a nation paralyzed by shortages. We need a path beyond the frameworks that bind us. To older Americans, it sounded like the echoes of Truman's Marshall Plan or Kennedy's call to put a man on the moon. It was the language of destiny, but spoken not in Washington, but in Ouagadougou. For millions of ordinary Burkinabe, the announcement stirred hope. Imagine a mother in a dusty rural clinic holding her newborn while praying the generator would last through the night. Imagine a farmer watching his grain rot in storage because there is no powered silo. Imagine soldiers staring into the desert night without the radar or communications equipment that could protect them. Could one machine, no larger than a suitcase, really change all of this? But for scientists, economists, and foreign powers, the announcement provoked alarm. Chikumbutso was no stranger to controversy. His claims of free energy had been dismissed by universities, ignored by Western laboratories, and denounced by physicists as violating the very laws of thermodynamics. In his homeland of Zimbabwe, reports surfaced accusing him of theatrics, presenting ordinary power stations disguised as inventions. Tech blogs questioned whether his so-called breakthrough was nothing more than a fantasy wrapped in patriotic pride. And so the question that gripped not just Burkina Faso, but the entire world, was simple. Was Traoré's gamble an act of visionary courage or the beginning of a national disaster? Yet before we can answer, we must follow the journey as it unfolded in a bunker under the earth of Ouagadougou on a night when a small green light flickered on and the balance of hope and fear shifted forever. But was this the birth of a revolution or the spark of a dangerous illusion? Stay with us. The night after his announcement, President Ibrahim Traoré invited Maxwell Chikumbutso into the underground chambers of the presidential palace in Ouagadougou. The setting was deliberate. It was a bunker of concrete walls, a place usually reserved for wartime meetings. On this night, it became a stage for an experiment that could decide the destiny of a nation. Generals, ministers, and advisors gathered in silence as Maxwell carried a plain metal case no larger than a suitcase. Inside, he claimed, was a compact generator capable of producing continuous electricity from the invisible radio frequencies that surround us every day. The atmosphere in the room was tense. For decades, Burkina Faso had been at the mercy of foreign fuel convoys and international lenders. Hospitals halted operations when diesel ran out. Children studied by candlelight when shipments were delayed. Soldiers waited in the dark for spare parts from abroad. The nation had endured drought, coups, and the dictates of Paris and Washington. Now the president was asking his people to believe in a machine that many experts insisted was impossible. Maxwell placed the device on the table. Its surface was unremarkable, a metal shell with a small green indicator. He pressed the switch. For a long half-minute, nothing happened. The bunker remained dim, its occupants staring in uneasy silence. Then suddenly the overhead bulbs flickered to life. Consoles lit up. The concrete chamber filled with bright white light. A general whispered to the man beside him, "To do this with diesel, we would need at least 25 liters every hour." Some looked on with awe. Others narrowed their eyes with suspicion. Was this the dawn of a revolution, or the clever trick of a man skilled at illusions? President Traore did not hesitate. He declared, "If we master this technology, Africa will never kneel again, neither before oil nor before the IMF." The statement was more than patriotic pride. It was a direct challenge to the structure of global power that had kept African nations dependent for generations. Inside that bunker, Burkina Faso seemed to touch the possibility of energy sovereignty. But outside those walls, the news was about to ignite a storm. The next morning, word leaked to the press. Headlines raced across global networks. Burkina Faso tests infinite energy device. In Washington, Paris, Beijing, and Moscow, emergency meetings were called. Energy ministers demanded reports. Intelligence agencies asked the same question again and again. Was Maxwell a fraud, or was he real? If his invention truly worked, the consequences for global energy markets were incalculable. The markets moved faster than politicians. Within a day, the price of Brent crude fell 20%. Companies tied to oil and battery industries lost over $150 billion in market value. Investors fled fossil fuels, uncertain of what might come next. In African cities, young people flooded social media with one message: hope has arrived. For the 600 million Africans still living without reliable electricity, the mere possibility of power drawn from the air itself was enough to stir dreams of a different life. In rural Burkina Faso, the reaction was deeply personal. A farmer imagined storing his grain in powered silos instead of watching it rot in the heat. A mother pictured a hospital where incubators never shut down. A teacher envisioned a classroom where children read under steady light rather than smoke from kerosene lamps. For them, the promise of a small generator humming in a palace bunker was more than technology. It was dignity. It was survival. Yet doubts spread just as quickly. Economists warned that investing state resources in an unproven invention could bankrupt the country. Opposition leaders reminded the public that Maxwell had faced accusations before. In Zimbabwe, journalists exposed his so-called free energy vehicle as nothing more than a repackaged car with hidden batteries. Analysts claimed that one of his prototypes was identical to a commercially available portable power station. Universities and scientific journals had long dismissed his claims as violations of basic physics. To many observers abroad, the demonstration in Ouagadougou was not evidence of a breakthrough, but a well-rehearsed performance. Still, the symbolism was undeniable. In a nation where 60% of electricity was imported, and more than 80% of domestic production relied on diesel. The appearance of a generator that ran without fuel was a powerful statement. It told the world that Africa was willing to dream beyond the systems that had kept it in chains. It also told ordinary citizens that their leader was willing to risk everything for a chance at independence. For Traoré, the gamble was clear. To continue as before meant slow decline, endless dependence, and the erosion of sovereignty. To bet on Maxwell's invention meant the possibility of failure, humiliation, and economic ruin. But it also meant the possibility of freedom. In that contrast lay the tension that electrified not only Burkina Faso, but the entire African continent. But if this invention truly threatened the balance of power, how would the great nations of the world respond? The images from the underground bunker spread like wildfire. A young African president stood beside a controversial inventor, their faces lit by the glow of a small machine. The caption that circulated on social media read simply, "Africa will not kneel." For ordinary citizens across the continent, the sight was almost biblical. It was not just electricity. It was liberation from decades of dependence. It was proof, or at least the hope, that Africa could write its own future. But in the halls of power, far beyond Ouagadougou, the mood was very different. In Washington, intelligence analysts debated the meaning of the demonstration late into the night. Was Maxwell Chikumbutso a fraud who had fooled a desperate leader? Or was he a pioneer who had discovered something the West could not control? One Pentagon official remarked, "If this is real, the 70-year order built since World War II is in danger." The words were not theoretical. American dominance had long rested on two pillars: military strength and control of global energy. Oil routes guarded by the Navy, financial systems tied to fuel scarcity, and international institutions built around dependency. If a landlocked African nation could suddenly generate power from the air, all of that could crack. In Paris, the reaction was sharper. French media denounced Burkina Faso as reckless. Commentators called the project an illusion that could destabilize the entire Sahel. France, already humiliated by losing influence in its former colony, warned of grave consequences. Behind the scenes, European diplomats worried not only about instability in West Africa, but also about the possibility that citizens at home might demand access to the same technology if it proved viable. The irony was painful. Ordinary Europeans, weary of high energy bills, whispered to each other, "What if it could work here too?" Moscow, on the other hand, saw opportunity. Russian media praised Traoré as the bold young lion who dared to challenge the West. Energy strategists quietly calculated how free African power could weaken OPEC and open doors for new alliances. In Beijing, the approach was pragmatic. Chinese envoys reached out to Ouagadougou, offering factories, infrastructure, and access to markets if Traoré aligned with their Belt and Road vision. For them, Africa's independence was not a threat, but a tool to weaken American influence. The markets moved violently. Oil prices fell by 20% in a single day. Tech companies tied to batteries and electric vehicles lost billions in value. Tesla, Panasonic, and others saw $150 billion wiped from their capitalization. Investors, uncertain of whether Maxwell's device was real or not, began pulling money from fossil fuel companies. For the poor of Africa, hope had arrived. For global markets, fear took its place. Inside Burkina Faso, the debate was even more intense. Supporters of Traoré hailed him as a visionary who dared to gamble for independence. They filled social media with images of the glowing generator and dreams of villages where children no longer studied under smoke, where hospitals never fell silent. Yet opposition leaders and economists warned of disaster. "If this fails," one former minister said on national radio, "we will be left mocked abroad, abandoned by lenders, and poorer than before." Some within the military shared the same concerns. They worried that Burkina Faso had painted a target on its back, daring powerful nations to sabotage what they could not control. And then came the turning point that gave weight to their fears. On the evening of September 23rd, just hours after Maxwell refused a reported $20 billion offer from foreign agents to sell his patents, a mysterious explosion ripped through one of Ouagadougou's laboratories. Flames consumed prototypes, research documents, and months of fragile progress. By dawn, the site was reduced to twisted steel and smoke. To many, it was proof that the great powers would never allow such an experiment to succeed without a fight. Others said it was evidence of incompetence, that the generators were unstable and dangerous. Maxwell himself barely survived. Pulled from the rubble with burns on his hands, he appeared shaken but resolute. Standing before cameras later that day, he said, "You can destroy our labs, but you cannot destroy an idea whose time has come." His words reignited hope among supporters, but they also deepened the mystery. Was he a prophet of Africa's liberation, or a showman clinging to illusions? For President Traoré, the gamble had reached its highest stakes. His country was divided between belief and doubt. International forces circled like predators. The image of light in a bunker had inspired millions, but the fire at the laboratory had exposed the dangers of defiance. The question now was not only whether the invention worked, but whether Burkina Faso could survive the storm that came with it. Would the dream of endless energy carry the nation forward, or would it draw the wrath of powers too strong to resist? In the days that followed the explosion, the streets of Ouagadougou buzzed with debate. For some, the sight of the ruined laboratory was a sign that Burkina Faso had invited too much danger upon itself. For others, it was undeniable proof that powerful foreign interests were willing to sabotage the nation's path to freedom. The nation stood at a crossroads, and the people could feel the weight of history pressing on their shoulders. In marketplaces, traders whispered about the strange events. A woman selling millet recalled how her son had studied under candlelight every evening because their home had no power. She clutched the photo of the glowing generator as if it were a talisman and said, "Even if they burn the machines, the idea cannot be killed." Nearby, an older man shook his head. "Ideas will not feed us if the country goes bankrupt chasing fantasies," he replied. This tension between hope and caution spread across the land. Economists took to the radio and warned the public. They reminded listeners that Burkina Faso already carried debt burdens tied to fuel imports. Over 60% of its electricity was still imported, and the country was borrowing to fund solar projects like the new Donson plant. Placing national funds into unproven technology, they argued, could push the economy toward collapse. If Maxwell's invention failed, the lenders who had long dictated terms through the IMF and World Bank might refuse support, leaving the nation isolated. Political opposition leaders seized on this fear. They accused President Traoré of gambling the nation's future for the sake of a dramatic photo and speeches filled with defiance. A responsible leader does not experiment with his people's survival, one opposition figure declared in Parliament. His words were echoed by others who feared that international donors and investors would pull back. Viewing Burkina Faso as unstable, The debate was not just about technology. It was about the very credibility of the state in the eyes of the world. Even within the military, divisions ran deep. Some officers admired the president's courage, convinced that foreign powers would never allow Africa to stand tall without resistance. They believed sabotage was inevitable, and that Burkina Faso had to show strength. Others feared that the nation had become a target. They worried about sanctions, covert operations, and the possibility of being cut off from international aid. In private conversations, soldiers asked whether they were being asked to defend a dream or to protect a dangerous illusion. For ordinary families, the consequences were immediate and emotional. In rural areas, people lit candles each night as they had always done, but now with a strange new hope that perhaps the darkness would not last forever. In the cities, students debated the events in classrooms, comparing Traoré's gamble to great historical moments when small nations dared to defy empires. At the University of Ouagadougou, a young student said, "If the Americans put a man on the moon, why cannot we try to light our own homes?" His words captured the spirit of a generation longing for dignity and independence. Yet there was also fear. Shopkeepers worried about rising prices if investors withdrew. Parents feared that scholarships tied to foreign programs would disappear. Farmers wondered if foreign buyers would boycott their produce in retaliation. The promise of energy sovereignty was inspiring, but the threat of isolation loomed large. Maxwell himself became a polarizing figure. To many, he was a hero standing beside Traoré against the weight of history. To others, he was a man with a record of unfulfilled promises, someone whose claims in Zimbabwe had already been called fraudulent. Newspapers abroad replayed the accusations, noting that his so-called free energy car was identical to a commercially available model, and that one of his devices resembled a store-bought portable power station. Yet his words after the explosion, "You can destroy our labs, but you cannot destroy an idea whose time has come," resonated deeply with those who wanted to believe. The political temperature rose with each passing day. Supporters of Traoré rallied in the streets, waving banners that read, "Africa's freedom" and "Light for all." Opposition groups held counter-protests, warning of ruin. Radio shows buzzed with callers arguing late into the night. The nation's fragile unity was strained, yet at its core was a question far larger than politics. Was Burkina Faso willing to risk everything to escape dependency, or would it retreat into the safety of the familiar chains? The people were divided, but the world was watching closely. How would the United States and its allies respond to a nation daring to step outside the order they had built? In Washington, the Burkina Faso experiment was not seen as a local curiosity. It was treated as a national security alarm. At the Pentagon, analysts pored over reports late into the night. Some dismissed the claims outright, suggesting that Maxwell's device violated every law of physics. Others urged caution, warning that even the appearance of success could destabilize entire regions. A classified briefing to senior officials laid out the stark possibilities. If the technology was false, Burkina Faso would collapse into economic turmoil. If it was real, the 70-year order that had shaped the modern world could unravel. Since the end of World War II, American dominance had relied on two anchors: unmatched military power and control over global energy. Shipping lanes guarded by the U.S. Navy, oil routes secured across the Middle East, and lending institutions like the IMF had kept much of the developing world tied to Washington's orbit. But if a small African country could light its homes and hospitals without oil, gas, or lithium, then entire continents might leap ahead, without dependence on American-led systems. To many in Washington, that prospect was more threatening than any army. Europe's reaction was fractured. Paris spoke with anger, accusing Ouagadougou of pursuing illusions that could destabilize the Sahel. Brussels was hesitant, worried about both instability and the possibility that citizens at home might demand access to new technology if it worked. Yet in quiet conversations, ordinary Europeans facing high energy bills wondered what would happen if the device could power their homes too. Moscow and Beijing viewed the events differently. Russian media celebrated Traore as a symbol of defiance. Strategists calculated how a free African power source could disrupt OPEC and open doors for new alliances. In Beijing, the government moved quickly with offers of partnership. Chinese envoys spoke of factories, infrastructure, and integration into global markets if Burkina Faso aligned itself with the Belt and Road vision. For Russia and China, this was not only about technology, it was about opportunity to weaken American influence. Meanwhile, institutions like the World Bank and IMF saw a direct threat to their very foundation. Their lending models rested on nations tied to scarcity. If Maxwell's generator proved real, then leverage over entire regions would vanish overnight. For them, the danger was not just financial, but existential. With suspicion, fear, and opportunity circling all at once, the question was clear. Would this be the beginning of a new era of cooperation, or the opening act of a conflict that no one could contain? As the dust settled over Ouagadougou, one truth remained clear. Burkina Faso had dared to dream. The laboratory may have been scarred by flames, and foreign powers may have moved in shadows to prevent success, but the vision itself refused to die. In the cold bunker beneath the presidential palace, the small generator still glowed. Its light cast across a map of Africa pinned to the wall, a quiet reminder that even in darkness, hope can survive. For the people of Burkina Faso, that glow was more than technology. It was a symbol that their leader had not surrendered, that their country would not simply bow to foreign dictates. Mothers saw in it the promise that hospitals could keep incubators running. Teachers saw the chance for children to read under steady light. Farmers imagined silos that preserved grain through the hottest seasons. Soldiers believed that perhaps their nation could defend itself with dignity. The image spread quickly across Africa, carried on phones into villages still lit only by kerosene lamps. To many, it became the photograph of the decade, a continent refusing to kneel. But destiny is never uncontested. The explosion that ripped through the laboratory was a warning. Sabotage, sanctions, or covert operations could follow. Economists warned that if the technology failed, Burkina Faso could be left isolated, mocked abroad, and abandoned by lenders. The stakes could not be higher. Success would bring freedom. Failure could mean disaster, and in between stood millions of ordinary citizens, caught between hope and fear. For the United States and its allies, the question lingers. Should Traore be viewed as a partner in progress, or as a threat to the stability of a system built over 70 years? If the technology proves real, will Washington seek cooperation, or will it move to contain a revolution that it cannot control? For older Americans who remember the Cold War, the echoes are unsettling. Once again, the world may be standing at the edge of a contest between order and change, between control and freedom. So we return to the question that opened this story. Is Ibrahim Traoré a visionary leader guiding Africa toward awakening? Or is he leading his nation into a perilous gamble? Will Maxwell Chikumbutso be remembered as a pioneer, or as a man whose promises collapsed under scrutiny? The answers are not yet written. History will decide, and history will remember where each of us stood. If this story has touched you, take a moment to reflect. Do you believe that freedom and dignity are worth the risk of failure? Do you believe that nations long chained to dependency can rise on their own terms? If so, share your thoughts. Let your voice join the conversation. Because a rising Africa is not just their story. It is a reminder to all of us that ordinary people can shape their destiny. May God bless Burkina Faso. May God bless Africa. And may the light of freedom never be extinguished.